The Sudanese government has cut diplomatic ties with the United Arab Emirates after repeatedly accusing the Gulf nation of backing the rival rapid support forces in the country's civil war. The announcement came as the RSF were blamed for attacks on the usually safe city of Port Sudan, which started on Sunday and have continued until today, that's Wednesday. Now, on Tuesday, Sudan's defense minister, that's Yassin Ibrahim, accused the UAE of violating his country's sovereignty through its proxy, the RSF. The UAE has repeatedly denied those allegations that it is giving financial, military, and political support to the paramilitary force. Now, we're being joined by Emmanuel Akinwotu, the correspondent covering the Sudan crisis for National Public Radio, to discuss the attacks on Port Sudan, allegations against the United Arab Emirates about arming Sudanese militia, as well as to weigh up the humanitarian crisis in that country and any chances of peace. Good afternoon. Many thanks for joining us.
Good afternoon. Thanks for having me.
Now, of course, we're discussing before we even came on about what you've witnessed, and you went into great detail. Very unfortunate indeed. But based on what you're aware of, what specific evidence substantiates the allegations of UAE arming the RSF beyond circumstantial connections?
Yes, there's been quite a degree of evidence put forward by various rights groups, by media organizations, and by UN experts. There have been several reports that have leaked to the media showing UN experts identifying specific weapons that the RSF were using that can only really substantially be traced to the United Arab Emirates. There's one report, at least one report that I know has been kind of contributed to by the Yale Humanitarian Research Lab, and they have done investigations on attacks in Darfur, in the west of Sudan, where the RSF are accused of a genocide. The RSF are a militia that really evolved from this infamous Arab militia group called the Janjaweed, and they committed a genocide 20 years ago, and this is a sort of continuation of that. And one of the weapons that Yale Humanitarian Research Lab identified that the RSF are using could only be traced to the UAE. They're the only country who've bought that weapon manufactured in China. So that's just one of the kind of instances that people have linked specific weapons that the UAE are using, that the RSF are using, to the UAE.
Now, I can imagine the scenario in the south, which is one of the youngest nations we have on earth right now, and the humanitarian the issues they've been having there. Well, let's talk about still on the main Sudan country as we know it. Earlier on, you were talking about life there in terms of humanitarian crisis. Can you give us a glimpse? We're looking at some of these visuals, burnt out buildings and stuff like that. So how do you conduct war with civilians still within the conflict zones?
Yeah, it's absurd really, because the conflict zones are everyday areas. People's homes and businesses, residential and commercial streets. In the war ignited in Houton, which is the capital city. You can imagine people's shock, like anywhere in the world, places that are beloved, historic, well-known, that suddenly become front lines. And that's essentially what happened to Houton. When you go there now, it's essentially a ghost town. It's extremely eerie, deserted, very, very few people there. The vast majority of the people, 6 million people who lived there, had to flee.
But when you say flee where? Were they, evacuated somewhere else? Or?
No, I mean, the foreigners were evacuated. Okay, right. Several foreign missions organized their citizens to leave, but the majority of people who lived there, Sudanese people, had to escape, and they escaped to other cities, they escaped outside of the country. Sudan had a pre-war population of about 45 million people. A third of the population have been displaced. About at least 3 million people have left the country. So the level of displacement in other parts of Sudan, you can imagine, is immense. Port Sudan, where these airstrikes have been, was really a sanctuary city. It was a place that you can it's kind of akin to Maiduguri in Borno, in that so much of Borno is unsafe, but Maiduguri is a haven, and it's similar in Port Sudan. It's one of the few, if not the only real major city where people could at least build some sort of a life. At least until last weekend, where the RSF started drone attacks on Port Sudan. I was there about 11, 12 days ago. The hotel I stayed in was struck. The oil depot was struck. The airport was struck. So it's civilian areas, and it's also military targets and also civilian targets. And Khartoum, going back to Khartoum, the situation there is devastating, but recently the Sudanese army recaptured it. It's meant that people have been free to kind of contemplate moving back. But the destruction in Khartoum is such that people can't really move back. It's not really livable. The level of looting there was just like astonishing, really. And that's from, they occupied the entire city for most of the war, and they occupied people's homes, businesses, they stole people's items, their jewelry, their clothes. They even stole electric cables. In so many houses and buildings, the electric cables have been ripped from the walls, and then the plastic remnants just dumped out in the street, apparently stripped for copper. And so there's no electricity, there's a shortage of water, and there's a famine. And so this is the context, and this isn't just happening in Khartoum, this is happening in other parts of Sudan. So you can imagine why places like Port Sudan, their temporary capital, was such an important, vital place. And also because that's also the main entry point for humanitarian aid into Sudan, by air and by the seaport. They bombed the seaport. This morning they attacked a naval base there for the Sudanese army. Yeah. They bombed the airport a couple of days ago. It's now the fourth day. Today's the fourth day of continuous strikes on Port Sudan. And so, on the one hand, we have a war between the Sudanese army and this paramilitary group that used to be their ally. But for many Sudanese people, the war is also against them, being waged by the RSF, because they're not just targeting civilian military targets, they're targeting Sudanese people and their infrastructure. For example, in Port Sudan, there's currently a power blackout because the power station was also struck. But there's a town in Sudan called Atbara, which is about 500 kilometers south of Port Sudan. It's where the main power station that powers northern Sudan is. We visited there a couple of weeks ago, and just a few days before, they had bombed the power station. And so engineers were trying to revive it, and a few days after we left, they bombed it again. And so, in a way, these attacks, analysts that we've spoken to, and they're essentially saying that these attacks by the RSF are essentially their way of sending a signal that nowhere in Sudan is safe, and that they're not prepared to allow the country to revive or rebuild itself in areas that the Sudanese army control.
Based on this last aspect that you just touched on about what the analysts are saying, I'm just wondering, I'm really curious about the intensity. I don't think we really heard much about the intensity regarding which regional powers might be responding practically, besides the traditional rhetorical condemnations. Mm-hmm. What have we heard anything that's matched the level of this conflict?
No, absolutely not. What we've heard is what you've seen, which is the usual statements, condemnation, although the condemnation is, a lot of it is not necessarily naming the RSF specifically. We've seen a lot of agencies condemn violence or attacks in a vague sense. We've seen a few actors, the US, for example, released a statement condemning the RSF specifically for the reported attacks. And so we do see these condemnations happening, but we don't see much more beyond that. There have not been any real meaningful international diplomatic interventions that can have a real impact on stopping the war. There are various countries that are involved in the war that are fueling it, and the UAE is essentially top of that list. There's so much evidence of them fueling and arming the RSF. But the UAE is also a strategic ally to several countries that would otherwise have the means or the power to intervene, including the US, the UK, and several countries. And so Sudan, in a way, is caught in the diplomatic impasse and reluctance to meaningfully hold the UAE to account.
And then when you have a scenario whereby, when you observe the conflict, it's like both sides claim one victory over the other, within the geopolitical space, as it were. But then it's neither here nor there. So when you look at that scenario, is there any peace in sight, regarding both parties? Because they're both digging in and not shifting grounds, as it were.
Yeah. It's often called a civil war, and in a sense it is, but this wasn't a war that Sudanese people asked for. This wasn't a war that they anticipated or called for. And this is essentially a power grab, or a fight over power by two entities that, launched a military coup over a civilian-led government. And now they're kind of fighting for supremacy in the country. Most people will see the Sudanese army as being more reflective of the state because they're one of the oldest, if not the oldest, institution. And the RSF is this paramilitary group. But, to answer your question, both sides are digging in and have no real sense of wanting to come to the negotiating table, in part because the actors fueling the war on both sides are not stopping the taps, not stopping the flow of weapons, not putting any real meaningful pressure on either side. And that's the kind of general kind of state of play. At the same time, I think a lot of Sudanese people are frustrated at any sense of equivalence between the Sudanese army and the rapid support forces, because people generally don't hold them as equivalent. You have the Sudanese army that's much more institutional in Sudan, and also is definitely complicit in the problems that have led Sudanese people here. But people still have a sense of representation or identification with the army that they definitely don't have generally with the RSF. The RSF, as I say, has its roots in this genocidal militia, and they are again committing the same genocide in Darfur, according to the UN, US, and others. And then, as again, just describing what we've seen in Houton, and in so many parts of Sudan, in Central Sudan, in Western Sudan, definitely, people do not see the RSF as a player with any interest of governing or acting in Sudanese interests. Actually, what we've seen through the war, just the level of atrocities, the vindictiveness of so many of them, the level of looting, sexual violence, torture, that actually this is a group that more than anything seems to be attacking Sudan for what it is. More than anything seems to be destroying the means for Sudan to actually even revive itself after the war.
So before I get to my question, you're saying there's no peace in sight, like what he was alluding to?
I think unless countries, international countries, so many of which unfortunately have had a stake and have been involved and have meddled in Sudanese affairs, unless those countries reach a kind of consensus over putting pressure on actors that are fueling the war, over holding both sides to a kind of negotiated settlement or peace, definitely, and one that definitely at least matches where Sudanese people generally feel right now, then there isn't any prospect of peace in sight. Okay. And both sides we've seen are digging in and see this as a war they have to win.
Well, in 30 seconds, so I just have to ask this question. How has this impacted you?
Yeah, I never really want to be the story. Obviously, as journalists,
you've seen all this.
Yeah, we all cover things. It's, it was definitely both extremely deeply bleak being there and seeing just the immense toll of the war on people, on places that I'd been and seen. It's unreal. But at the same time, it was also incredible the level of resilience and the desperation that people have to try and rebuild their lives. Sudanese people are some of the most hospitable people in the world. We're constantly going to meet people whose homes have been destroyed, who have nothing. They'll still make sure that they offer you tea and dates and water. They really, like no country in the world deserves war, and they've suffered this for more than 2 years. And the sad thing is, it doesn't seem like this is going to end soon.
Well, those are grim realities there. Emmanuel Akinwotu, NPR correspondent, would like to thank you very much for your thoughts on the crisis in Sudan. It's good to have you with us.
Thanks so much. Thank you.